Well, thank you, President Anderson. It's a delight to be here. I'm surprised so many people have come because this is such a wonderful day. You should be out sitting on the beaches next to the lake. Well, I want to talk about these founders that we all know about and why we honor them in the way we do. It's extraordinary, it seems to me. They have a special significance for us. And celebrating in the way we do this generation that fought the revolution and created the Constitution is, however, peculiar to us as a people. As far as I know, no other major nation honors its past historical characters, especially characters of 200 years past, in quite the same manner we do. We want to know what Thomas Jefferson, these are the kinds of questions people, laymen, ask me. What would Thomas Jefferson think of affirmative action? What would George Washington think of the invasion of Iraq? As far as I know, the British don't have to check in periodically with either one of the two William Pitts to find out how David Cameron's government is doing. This seems to be unique to us, this kind of special need that we have for these authentic historical characters in the here and now. And I'm interested in why this should be so. Now, scholars have a variety of answers for this question. Some suggest that our continual concern with constitutional jurisprudence and original intent accounts for our fascination with the founding and with the creation of the Constitution. Still others think that we use these 18th century figures in order to recover what was wise and valuable in our past. They believe that the founders of 200 years ago represent a kind of gold standard against which we measure our current political leaders. Why don't we have such leaders today seems to be the implicit question, and sometimes explicit question, that many Americans ask. But the most important reason, in my mind, for our preoccupation with this generation has to do with our sense of identity as Americans, of the kind of people we are. The identities of other nations, say being French or being German, are lost in the mists of time and are usually taken for granted by those people, those nations, which is why such nations are having much greater problems than we have with immigration. We think we have problems with immigration, but they pale into insignificance with the kinds of problems the European nations are facing now and will face through the rest of this 21st century. We became a nation in 1776, and thus, in order to know who we are, we need to know who the founders are. The United States was founded on a set of beliefs, not, as were other nations, on a common ethnicity or a common language or a common religion. Not only did our revolution in 1776 legally create the United States, but I think it infused into our culture almost everything we value, everything we believe. Our noblest ideals, our highest aspirations came out of that event. Our beliefs in liberty, equality, constitutionalism, the well-being of ordinary people. It's these aspirations and ideals that hold us together and make us a single people. I don't think Starbucks and McDonald's can do it. We need to have this kind of sense of identity coming from our beliefs. Since we're not a nation in any traditional sense of the term, in order to establish our nationhood, we have to reinforce, I think, and refresh periodically the values of the men who declared independence from Great Britain and framed the Constitution. So as long as the Republic endures, in other words, I think we're destined to go back to this founding. Now, Abraham Lincoln knew this. He identified completely with the founders and thought all Americans should do so too. Now, present-day academics have sometimes mocked the close feelings that many ordinary Americans today have for the founders. But it's not so easy to mock Lincoln. The American people of 1858, said Lincoln, deeply felt the moral principle of equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and this moral principle made them one with the founders. In Lincoln's words, as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. This emphasis on liberty and equality, he said, was the electric cord that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. So despite what Tom Brokaw said, I think this is our greatest generation. These revolutionary leaders, they were larger than life, giants in the earth, a forest of giant oaks, Lincoln called them. They seem to possess intellectual and political capacities well beyond those of the generations that followed them. We Americans have been unable to look back at them without being overawed by the brilliance of their thought, the very creativity of their politics, and the sheer magnitude of their achievement. So what were they like? What made them different? Different from us, and maybe different from previous generations. Great as they were, the revolutionary leaders were certainly not demigods or superhuman individuals. They were very much the product of peculiar circumstances and a peculiar moment in time, and that's the thrust of what I want to say this evening. Nor were they immune to the allures of interest that attracted most ordinary people then. They wanted wealth and position and often speculated heavily in order to realize their aims. So they're not demigods, but they were not Democrats either, certainly not Democrats in any modern manner of the term. They were never embarrassed by talk of elitism. They didn't use that term, but they weren't embarrassed by being superior to ordinary folk, and they never hid that sense of superiority they felt to ordinary people. But neither were they contemptuous of common people. In fact, they always believed that the people in general were the source of their authority. So I think for one moment in time, we had a nice balance between what we might call democratic and aristocratic values. But even in their own undemocratic time and circumstances, they were unusual, if not unique. As political leaders, they comprised a peculiar sort of elite, a self-created aristocracy largely based on merit and talent that was unlike the hereditary nobility that ruled 18th century English society. Now, 18th century British society, or Britain, remained under the authority of about 400 noble families, whose fabulous scale of landed wealth, political influence, and aristocratic grandeur was unmatched by anyone in North America. The Duke of Rockingham's house in Northumberland, his country house, was 650 feet long. That's longer than 2 football fields. Now compare that with, say, William Byrd's Westover mansion, and William Byrd, one of the wealthiest Virginia planters. His house, which is still standing at a tourist site, is about 90 feet long. While Charles Carroll of Maryland, who was one of the wealthiest planters in the American South, was earning what Americans regarded as a huge sum of 1,800 pounds a year, the Earl of Derby's vast estates were bringing in an annual income of over 40,000 pounds. By English standards, American aristocrats like Washington and Jefferson, even with their hundreds of slaves, remained minor gentry at best. And by the English measure of status, lawyers like John Adams and Hamilton were even less distinguished. Gentlemen, no doubt, but nothing like the English nobility. The American revolutionary elite was thus very different from the English aristocracy. But that very difference, and this is my contention, it was ideally suited to exploit the peculiar character of the 18th century Enlightenment, in the Anglo-American Enlightenment. The 18th century Enlightenment was preoccupied with politeness, which had a much broader meaning for people then than the term has for us. It implied much more than manners and decorum. It meant affability, sociability, and most important, cultivation. Indeed, politeness was considered to be the source of civility, which was soon replaced, much to the chagrin of Dr. Johnson, by the word civilization. To be civilized, in other words, was to be enlightened. And to be enlightened was to be civilized. Civilization, of course, implied a social process. Societies, it was assumed, moved through successive stages of historical development, starting with the famous 4-stage theory, very popular in the end of the 18th century, starting with hunter-gathering, shepherding, farming, and finally in the 4th and final stage of commerce. It began, in other words, in rude simplicity, and a people progressed to refined complexity as they became more and more civilized. And all nations could be located along this spectrum of social development. Since civilization was something that could be achieved, Everything was enlisted in order to push back barbarism, push back ignorance, and spread civility, refinement, enlightenment. All sorts of new organizations and instruments sprang up in the 18th century to spread light and knowledge among people. Learned societies, lending libraries, debating clubs, assembly rooms, reading groups, gentlemanly magazines, concerts, galleries, museums. 18th century English speakers saw the beginning of culture as a public commodity, as something that was valuable, that gave status, that could be acquired. In other words, the cultural world that we're familiar with, that we take for granted, was born in this age of enlightenment. Now, at the center of this new civilized world was the idea of a gentleman. Defining a proper gentleman was a subject that fascinated the educated public of the 18th century. And writers from Richard Steele, Addison and Steele, the Roger de Coverley papers, The Spectator, to Jane Austen, spent their lives struggling with what constituted the proper character of a gentleman. Indeed, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were still going at it in their correspondence during their retirement years. For many in the 18th century, including the American revolutionaries, being a gentleman assumed a moral meaning that was more important than its social significance. Pure monarchists might still define aristocracies exclusively by the pride of their families, the size of their estates, the lavishness of their display, and the arrogance of their bearing. But others increasingly downplayed or ridiculed these characteristics. Think of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth Bennet is looking for the proper gentlemanly husband. And Mr. Darcy doesn't really, at first, in her mind, fit the bill. He's got a lot of money, £10,000 a year coming in. He's got bloodlines. Lady de Burgh, he's got all the attributes of the old-fashioned aristocracy, but that's not what Elizabeth Bennet wants. She wants taste, character, a moral kind of definition of her proper gentleman, her proper husband. And in fact, Austen, in her other novels, is obsessed by this, finding what is a proper gentleman. Think of Mr. Knightley and Emma, the same kinds of characteristics. This enlightened age, in other words, emphasized new man-made criteria, the man-made criteria of aristocracy and gentility, politeness, grace, taste, learning, character. They did so much that even those who had inherited their title, like Lord Chesterfield, were embarrassed to claim a blood inheritance, and they like to think that their position, Chesterfield liked to think that his position was earned through merit and talent, not to inheritance. To be a gentleman, in other words, was to think and act like a gentleman, nothing more. It meant being reasonable, tolerant, honest, virtuous. All the characteristics that Elizabeth Bennet was looking for in her husband. Being a gentleman was the prerequisite to being a political leader, of course. It signified being cosmopolitan, standing on elevated ground in order to have a large view of human affairs, and being free of the prejudices, the parochialism, and the religious enthusiasm of the vulgar, the barbaric. It meant, in short, having all those characteristics that we today sum up in the idea of a liberal arts education. Indeed, the 18th century created the modern idea of a liberal arts education in the English-speaking world. Now, this age-old distinction between gentlemen and commoners had a vital meaning for the revolutionary generation that we today have totally lost. I mean, we put gentlemen on our restroom doors. Hardly what they thought about it. It marked for them a horizontal cleavage that divided the social hierarchy into two very unequal parts, almost as sharply as the distinction between officers and soldiers divided the army. Indeed, the military division was related to the larger social one, and we still use the term officer and gentleman in conjunction with one another. Gentlemen who constituted in North America about 5 to 10% of the society, 5% in the South, 10% in New England. They were all those at the top of the social hierarchy who were wealthy enough to not have to work, or at least not have to work with their hands. They were those who seemed able to act in a disinterested manner in promoting a public good. I might mention that Franklin, because he was a worker, he was a businessman, but that was frowned upon. He couldn't be a gentleman and still be running a business. Even if he had 20 employees bringing in more money than anyone else in the city of Philadelphia, he had to retire from business, as he did at the age of 42 in 1748, to become a gentleman. And it's at that point that he turns to what gentlemen did, engage in science and public service. Disinterestedness is the term they often used, the most common term, as a kind of synonym for the classical conception of virtue or self-sacrifice, willingness to give up your private interest, to sacrifice your private interest for the sake of a public good. It meant being impartial, rising above an emotional or selfish, pecuniary, or any other kind of interest that you might have. We probably today have lost most of this earlier meaning. Even educated people now use the term disinterested to mean uninterested, not caring. And you'll find in dictionaries, good dictionaries, both meanings will be there, not caring, but also the older, impartial, rising above an interest. Even when you have an interest, you rise above it. That meaning has been lost to us. It's almost as if we can't conceive of anybody being disinterested anymore in this old-fashioned sense. Although I think there are two occupations left in our world that we really count on people being disinterested. Can you think of them, what they might be? No, I don't think scientists fit, no academics fit this category. Well, judges. I think we still count on judges being impartial, rising above an interest. They're supposed to recuse themselves in the case of some interest. They try to live up to that, although as we can see from the controversies over confirmation hearings, we have our doubts about judges. But there is one occupation that we really do count on the participants being impartial, disinterested, and a whole world depends on it. Can you think of? No, not the military. No, I'm thinking of referees and umpires in our sporting empire. Think about it. I mean, a kid grows up in Boston, and he's a Red Sox fan, and he becomes an umpire, and he's umpiring a Yankees-Red Sox game. He's supposed to transcend his emotional connection with the Red Sox and make disinterested judgments. That's what they meant by that. And I do think our sports referees and umpires, we still consider them to be of that sort. Otherwise, this whole empire of sports affairs would crumble. There were controversies about this word disinterested. John Adams was very upset with the reputation that Washington acquired of disinterestedness. And that's the term Washington used most of the time to describe himself. And it's what he wanted to be thought of as disinterested. That's why he refused to accept a salary as commander-in-chief. Now, Adams, of course, very jealous of Washington's fame, which he had achieved already by 1783. And he writes in 1785, he writes to an English friend, and I'll just quote one sentence from that letter. He goes on about this disinterested. He says, "I know very well that the word disinterested turns the heads of the people by exciting their enthusiasm. But although there are disinterested men, they are not enough in any age or any country to fill all the necessary offices. And therefore, the people may depend upon it that the hypocritical pretense of disinterestedness will be set up to deceive them much oftener than the virtue will be practiced for their good." Very cynical view, but coming out of his own jealousy, I think, of Washington. Franklin, as you perhaps know, in the Constitutional Convention made very few proposals, but one of his major proposals at a crucial moment was, and he was very much in favor of this notion of disinterested, and he was very much admiring of Washington for receiving no salary. He proposed that every member of the executive branch, from the president on down, should receive no salary. That should be written into the Constitution. Well, as Madison writes in his notes, there's a long pause. And finally, somebody tabled the motion, more out of, as Madison says, more out of respect to the old man than respect for the practicality of the scheme. But that was the sense that people had, that wealthy people should dedicate themselves without personal interest to public service. And as you may know, all members of the House of Commons served without pay until 1911, which is trying to fulfill this notion, this aristocratic notion, that you owed the country this, you owed your public service as a wealthy gentleman. Now, as aspiring gentlemen, the leaders of this revolutionary generation shared all of these assumptions I've been talking about work, about politeness, about civilization. Indeed, they were primed to receive all these new enlightened ideas about civility and gentility, more so than people in England itself. They resembled, in their enthusiasm for these ideas and in their creativity, the Scots, another provincial people living on the edges of the greater British world. And I want to compare these two people who both had an outpouring of creativity at the end of the 18th century, and we have to ask the question, why? Why should the Scots and the North Americans be so creative while the English themselves, as Gibbon complained, seemed complacent and without fresh thinking? Let me just mention some of the comparisons. Both the Americans and the Scots, as I say, were provincial peoples living on the periphery of the metropolitan English world. Both of them lacked the presence of the great hereditary noble families that were at the ruling center of English public life. The great nobles in Scotland, after the Act of Union in 1707, which, as you know, is presently in danger, the Act of Union, after that Act of Union, they all moved south to London, where the action was. And it meant that it left Scotland, Edinburgh and Glasgow, in the hands of minor gentry, professional people, the Adam Smiths, and so on, and the David Humes of Glasgow and Edinburgh. The uppermost levels of the aristocracy were gone, just as they didn't exist in America, North America either. And of course, these were relatively small landholders, professional people who, in both areas, North America and Scotland, were anxious to have their status determined less by their ancestry or the size of their estates and more by their behavior, their learning, their character, these enlightened values. Secondly, both the Scots and the North Americans were acutely aware of the contrast between civilization and the nearby barbarism, in the case of Scotland, of the Highland clans, and in the case of North America, the Indians. It's hard for us to realize, but most people living in Edinburgh and Glasgow looked upon those Highland clansmen as just as savage and barbaric as Americans living in Philadelphia thought of the Indians on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. So both groups, both the North Americans and Scots, were acutely aware of the degrees of civilization, and they spent a lot of time writing and reading essays on the stages of social progress. And you have essays, commencement addresses entitled From Rudeness to Refinement, and they were trying to figure out where did they stand on this spectrum. They knew they lived in a cruder and more simple society than the English, and that England was well along in the fourth and final stage of social development, in its commercial development, its sophistication. And that because it was further along, it had much to offer them in the ways of politeness and refinement and civilization. Yet, at the same time, both the Scots and the North Americans knew only too well that the polite and sophisticated metropolitan center of the empire was steeped in luxury and corruption. England had sprawling, poverty-ridden cities, over-refined manners, gross inequalities of rank, complex divisions of labor, and the widespread manufacturings of luxuries, all symptoms of over-advanced social development and social decay. England, in other words, seemed to many people in both Scotland and in North America to be on the verge of dissolution. So, provincials in Scotland and North America began, I think, to feel an acute ambivalence about being part of the British Empire. What I'm going to try to explain very briefly is what you might call the sociology of creativity. They were proud of their simple native provinces, but keenly aware at the same time of the metropolitan center of civilization that was London. Both Americans and the Scots, in other words, had the unsettling sense of living in two cultures simultaneously. Although this experience may have been disturbing, and it certainly was disturbing, it was at the same time very stimulating and creative. Provincial creativity. I would use some analogies, or use analogies of novelists in the 20th century, American novelists in the 20th century, of this idea of living in two worlds, cultural worlds, simultaneously. Let's go back to the beginning. In the Midwest, here in Chicago or in Minneapolis, you have this flowering of creativity, novelists like Sinclair Lewis and Dreiser and Sherwood Anderson and so on. It comes out of, I think, this realization that these men who grew up in this area had, that they were Midwesterners, but they were also aware of a larger cosmopolitan world in New York or London. And they were aware, the awareness of being in two worlds, I think, was a source of creativity. Now you can go through the other groups in the 20th century. Southerners, acutely conscious of being Southern, but also aware of a non-Southern larger world in New York or London. And so you have this outpouring of creativity among Southern writers. We know them all: Faulkner, Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, and so on. Blacks had the same kind of experience, acutely conscious of being black, a black world in a non-black world. Being aware of both worlds simultaneously is disturbing, unsettling, but creative, stimulating. And we have James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and so on. And Jews, of course, clearly a good example of this kind of simultaneous cultural sharing, living in a Jewish world, aware of it, but also aware of a non-Jewish world. And being part of two worlds at the same time, I think, is unsettling, but creative. Now, the classic example, of course, are the Irish. Going back to Jonathan Swift, all up through James Joyce, right up into our own time. Why should that be so? It's not in their DNA. It had to do with the fact that they were living in two worlds. They're Irish, but they're also writing in English, aware of the English world, and that was disturbing to them, but also a source of their creativity. That's the point I'm trying to make, that these North Americans and Scots were experiencing a similar kind of duality, if you will, simultaneous experience of being in two cultural worlds at the same time. And it helps explain why they should have been, those places should have been such remarkable places of enlightenment and intellectual ferment in the English-speaking world at the end of the 18th century. Scots like David Hume or Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, John Millar certainly matched, if they did not exceed, the American founders in brilliance and creativity. These are the men who really created modern social science. And in some respects, many might think they were even more creative than our own founders. Living so close to what they regarded as savagery and barbarism, both the Scots and the North Americans felt compelled to think freshly about the meaning of being civilized. And in the process, they put a heightened emphasis on learned and acquired values at the expense of the traditional inherited values of blood and kinship. They enthusiastically adopted the new enlightened 18th century ideals of gentility. Preoccupied with their honor or their reputation, or in other words, the way they were represented and viewed by others, that's what they meant by honor, how they're looked at by other people, these revolutionary leaders inevitably became characters, self-fashioned performers in the theater of life. Now, theirs was not character as we are apt to define it today, as the inner personality that contains hidden contradictions and flaws. Instead, their idea of character was the outer life, the public persona, trying to show the world that he was living up to the values and duties that the best of the culture imposed on him. They're very self-conscious about presenting themselves as being enlightened. The revolutionary leaders committed themselves, I think, seriously, sincerely, to behaving in a certain moral, virtuous, and civilized manner. In fact, I think the intense self-consciousness, the self-conscious seriousness with which they made this commitment was what ultimately separates them from later generations of American leaders. But that commitment also sets them sharply apart from the older world of their fathers and grandfathers. They were men of high ambition, yet of relatively modest origins. And this combination made achieved rather than ascribed values naturally appealing to them. Almost all the revolutionary leaders were first generation, and this goes down to the second, third, fourth tier levels of leadership. were first-generation gentlemen. That is to say, almost all were the first in their families to attend college. And of course, in the case of Franklin and Washington, they didn't attend college at all. Most of them, the others, did attend college and were the first in their families to acquire a liberal arts education and to display the new 18th century marks of an enlightened gentleman. Now, Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, did not go to college, but he was a wealthy Virginia planter and a surveyor who married successfully into the prestigious Randolph family, a real FFV. But he was not a refined and liberally educated gentleman. He did not read Latin. He did not know French. He did not play the violin. And as far as we know, those are things that Thomas Jefferson did. And as far as we know, Peter Jefferson never once questioned the idea of a religious establishment or the owning of slaves. But his son, Thomas Jefferson, was very different. Indeed, all the revolutionaries knew things that their fathers had not known, and they were eager to prove themselves by what they believed and valued by their disinterestedness. But there was one prominent revolutionary leader who did not seek to play that role. On the face of it, Aaron Burr had all the credentials for being a great founder. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, a Princeton graduate, a charming and wealthy aristocrat. He eventually became senator from New York and vice president, third vice president of the United States. Think of who his predecessors were: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. He was a distinguished, up-and-coming gentleman in the eyes of his colleagues. But something set his character apart from his colleagues. He inherited his claim to leadership. John Adams said that he had never known in any country the prejudice in favor of birth, parentage, and descent more conspicuous than in the case of Colonel Burr. Burr was the son of a president of Princeton and the grandson of another Princeton president, none other than Jonathan Edwards, the great 18th century theologian. Burr, said Adams, was connected by blood with many respectable families in New England. Unlike the other leaders of the revolutionary generation, unlike Jefferson or Washington or Adams or Hamilton, Madison, Franklin, Burr was born fully and unquestionably into whatever nobility, whatever gentility 18th century America had. And unlike the other revolutionary leaders, Burr never felt that he had to earn his aristocratic status. Aristocracy was in his veins, in his blood, and he never forgot it. Consequently, Burr behaved very differently from the other revolutionary leaders, especially in promoting his own selfish interests in the expense of the public good. He never talked about virtue. He never seemed to be concerned about his persona. And he was not, as Hamilton said in the most searing indictment that one could give in that age, he was not concerned with fame. His fame. His letters are a mess. There are only 2 volumes of them, and most of them have to do with patronage or some deal that he's engineering. And usually they end with some little scrawl, "Burn this letter," because they're so self-interested. He had one letter when he learned of Hamilton's bank, and he writes to a friend, he says, "Oh, I remember reading something in Hume about a bank," but he says, "I haven't got time to turn to it." He was too much engaged in his own promotion of his interests. And in the end, that difference brought him down from both ends, not deliberately, but from both ends of the political spectrum. Jefferson on one end and Hamilton on the other conspired, but not consciously, in the end brought Burr down. He became the great exception, I think, that proves the rule that I'm trying to demonstrate here. Yet the very high-mindedness of these mainstream revolutionary leaders raises some fundamental questions. If it was the intense commitment of this generation to new enlightened values that separates it from other generations, why, it might be asked, and it has been asked by recent critical historians, why didn't these so-called enlightened and liberally educated gentlemen do more to reform their society? Why did they fail to enhance the status of women? Why did they not eliminate slavery entirely instead of just in the North? Why didn't they treat the Indians in a more humane manner? Now, it's true that the founders did not accomplish all of many of them wanted. It turned out that they did not control their society and culture as much as they thought they did. And in the end, they were no more able accurately to predict their future than we can predict our future. In the end, many of their enlightened hopes in their kind of elitist leadership were done in by the very democratic and egalitarian forces that they had unleashed with their revolution. Now, no doubt all of them assumed instinctively that the Western territories would eventually belong to the American settlers. There's never any doubt of that. The Indians were not going to be able to hold out all of that land for hunting and gathering. But many of them were at the same time scrupulously concerned for the fate of the Indians who occupied those territories. Indeed, the statements of Washington's Secretary of War, Henry Knox, in the 1790s, in a series of letters he writes to the President, describing his concern about preserving Indian culture and not overriding it and destroying it. Even Knox's letters, a modern anthropologist might applaud. But purchasing the Indians' rights to the land and assimilating or protecting them in a civilized manner, which is what Knox recommended, depended on an orderly and steady pace of settlement. But the ordinary white settlers who moved west, flushed with confidence that they were indeed the chosen people of God their leaders told them they were, paid no attention to the plans and policies concocted in eastern capitals. They went ahead and rapidly and chaotically scattered westward and thus stirred up warfare with the Indians, into which the federal government was inevitably drawn. Democracy and demography did the same for the other hopes and plans of the founders. All of the prominent leaders thought that the liberal principles of the revolution would eventually destroy the institution of slavery. Not a single one of them thought that slavery was not incompatible with the meaning of the revolution. When even Southerners like Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and Henry Lawrence publicly deplored the injustice of slavery, from that moment, declared the New York physician and abolitionist E.H. Smith in 1798, from that moment, the slow but certain death wound was inflicted upon it. They thought it was going to die naturally. Of course, such predictions could not have been more wrong. Far from being doomed, slavery in the United States in the 1790s was on the verge of its greatest expansion. Indeed, at the end of the Revolutionary era, there were more slaves in the nation, despite manumissions in the North, more slaves in the nation than had existed in 1760. But such self-deception, such mistaken optimism by the leaders was understandable, for they wanted to believe the best, and initially there was evidence that slavery was dying out. The northern states, where slavery was not inconsequential, my own state had 7% enslaved. New York City was 14% of its population was enslaved. In the North, every one of the states was busy trying to eliminate the institution. By 1804, all had done so. The founders thought the same thing might happen in the southern states. It would happen. Let me give you one example of what I'm getting at. William and Mary, the College of William and Mary in 1791 gave an honorary degree to Granville Sharp, who was the leading British abolitionist at the time. Now, why would these southern planters who ran the college do that? Not only were there more anti-slave societies created in the South than in the North, but manumissions in the Upper South grew rapidly in the years immediately following the end of the war. And many thought ending the international slave trade in 1808 would eventually kill off the institution of slavery. Now, the reason the founders so readily took the issue of slavery off the table in the 1790s was because of this mistaken faith in the future. They lived with illusions, many illusions. As Oliver Ellsworth, the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, declared, as population increases, poor laborers will be so plenty as to render slaves useless. Slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. And you can duplicate those kinds of optimistic predictions over and over. They simply did not count on the remarkable demographic capacity of the slave states themselves, particularly Virginia, to produce slaves for the expanding areas of the Deep South and the Southwest. And whatever the revolutionary leaders might have wished for in ending slavery was nullified, of course, by the demands of ordinary white planters, white farmers in the South, for more and more slaves. So if we want to know why we can never again duplicate or replicate this extraordinary generation of the founders, I think there's a simple answer. The growth of what we today presumably value most about our society and its culture. It's egalitarian democracy. In the early 19th century, the voices of ordinary people, at least ordinary white people, began to be heard as never before in the history of the world, and they soon overwhelmed the high-minded desires, high-minded aims of the revolutionary leaders who had brought them into being. The founders had succeeded only too well in promoting democracy and equality among ordinary folk. Indeed, they succeeded in preventing any duplication of themselves. Thank you. Thank you very much.